Hi, everyone. Welcome to the May 9th API Machinery meeting. We've got a few agenda items, so let's just get started. Stefan, are you on to kick us off?
Yes, so yeah, I put everything there. There's a PR for graceful deletion by adding a spec field to enable that. And the question is, do we want that? To my understanding, graceful deletion is predecessor of finalizers, kind of. So one could simulate that by setting the timeout field, or we go forward with graceful deletion. Just a poll for opinions.
I think that's a great question. Do we implement graceful deletion in anything besides pods?
I thought there was a general field for it.
There is a general field for it, but it is arguably a mistake. Somebody's talking and we couldn't hear you.
So I'll chime in with just some experience we had recently. Now, I know there was a bug in Kubernetes that Jordan fixed, but one thing that you find if you're doing finalizers, for example, with custom resources is that because you have to have your own controller that presumably is running in a pod, if you delete that controller, then obviously there's nothing left to handle finalizers versus what you have in with the built-in components where you can use a finalizer on a pod or whatever, and as long as that's one of the core cluster components, you can reasonably assume it's not going to get deleted. So just a slight difference between core versus non-core, but I think it's worth mentioning because we definitely had an issue where people couldn't delete some of our stuff because they accidentally deleted the controller that was dealing with the finalizers.
Yeah, and that's a general failure condition with the finalizer, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
You could, yeah, maybe you can set up the deployment running the controller to have a garbage collector relationship with the CRD object. Oh wait,
yeah,
they're not in the same namespace.
Yeah, you can't establish the links in the other direction.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe we should make an issue about that. I'm not sure if we should, even if we wanted to implement graceful deletion period in more places, is custom resources the best place to start?
Well, you could legitimately say it as the case you have now, but I am struggling with the why would I want graceful deletion over a finalizer?
Yeah, if we'd had finalizers in the beginning, would we have added graceful deletion?
Well, we did have finalizers in the beginning, but they were specific to namespaces.
Yeah. So we didn't really have the general purpose weapon there. I wonder if the architecture SIG would be interested in this question, actually. I think if it were up to me, I would say use finalizers because those are more general purpose than the graceful deletion period.
I don't. So if we use a finalizer to implement the graceful deletion, how do we denote how long is the graceful period? Do we use the same field?
That's a fairly good point. I guess you could detect yourself based on prefix and then parse. That'd be nasty.
I mean, you could do it. Yeah, you could do it as part of the finalizer. You could do it as a label or as an annotation. Not that I particularly like those. Or you could, if it's part of the resource, it makes sense for pods to have a time limit, and that could just be that could be a field in the pod spec instead of in metadata, right?
How can the finalizer handle the knows which field?
Because the finalizer would be written specifically for that object. It's not a general purpose finalizer.
Yeah, so the thing I like about finalizers is that it makes it very clear who's responsible for doing the cleanup. So pods have graceful deletion, and it's implicitly the kubelet who's responsible for coming back and doing the final delete. But that, when you generalize that, I like having the record like on the object, like who's blocking this? Who are we waiting on? So I like finalizers more than graceful deletion, I think.
Let's see, we have on chat, Anthony says, the original user request also wanted the ability to force delete by kube control. Is that possible with finalizers?
You can patch. So you have a force, but you have to really, really mean it.
Yeah. Yeah, it is possible, but not easy. We should probably think about whether we want to make force delete on kube control actually go ahead and remove finalizers for you.
Yeah, so there are two things there. One is that normal users probably shouldn't be able to remove finalizers. Like, we're starting to use finalizers for things like persistent storage cleanup and making sure, like, if we want to actually be able to rely on those, like, random user Joe shouldn't be able to delete a finalizer the system has added and is counting on.
Yeah. I wonder if we should like do something like move or add a sub-resource that lets you access finalizers, which we can permission separately, because
I would like to have that quite a bit as a generic polymorphic resource that is easy to add.
It'd be great to have another example along with scale, right?
Hey, it'd be good. It's also a really useful one, right? Like the permissions on the controller right now are huge, incredibly broad.
It's super scary to let people force remove finalizers that are like cleaning up storage or whatever. You could do a lot of damage to your cluster doing that.
So I would be in favor of doing it. I don't know that we have time in 1.11, but if we like the idea, teeing that up for potential project for 1.12 sounds like a good idea to me.
Just to rewind a little bit, so if we use finalizers, it will up to every resource to implement its own graceful deletion. They can pick a random finalizer name. They can put the graceful deletion period in a random.
It would be up to every resource, but we have like one resource right now that uses.
You could also write a generic one that was opinionated as to where you look for it. Right.
To be clear, it's always been up to every resource to write their own graceful deletion.
Yeah, it's not like
we only have one resource today, and it's pods, and the graceful deleter is the kubelet.
Yeah.
I want to stress one point which we just discussed more or less. So finalizers are something a user should not change. So you should not be able to override by force or anything like that. Graceful deletion is something waiting for a process to terminate in a pod, which one should be able to override as a user because it's not critical, it's not bad. It's not about cleanup, it's about enforcing something which takes time and make it faster by hard killing. It's a different thing.
Yeah, I think my interpretation of that is we may need a mechanism where the finalizer can take whether it's an important one or an unimportant one.
Or I guess for graceful deletion, right, I think a user should be able to control the time that you wait, but I don't know that a user gets to decide whether something is gracefully collected or not.
Yeah, I could see connecting the plumbing so that we record, like if a graceful deletion time period comes in with a delete request, recording that. Like it doesn't bother me to record that, but I would expect the enforcement and ultimate cleanup to be done via finalizers. So that's more just plumbing the information from the user so that if you have a finalizer that wants to make use of that information, it can.
So I have one question for Stefan before we go on to the next topic, which is what is the motivation for adding graceful deletion to CRDs?
I think this comes from the KubeWord project. So it's about virtual machines and shutting them down cleanly or not cleanly. It's similar to pods, basically.
Okay.
But in the VM case.
Yeah, I think if just my gut take on that is that a finalizer is probably a better idea anyway, because the semantics they need may not be 100% time-based.
So Jordan, about your idea. So if we record the deletion timeout in this meta field, this would do it, right? Then the finalizer can enforce or speed up shutdown.
Maybe. I'd have to look at how the storage is structured, but I kind of like preserving the information from the user, and if a finalizer wants to use it, it can.
Wait, I thought we already had a deletion timestamp in the field.
Deletion timestamp, but that just records when it was deleted. The grace period doesn't get preserved unless the storage says, yep, I'm a storage that knows how to deal with grace period.
There is a field, right? For grace period.
There is a field, but it's not populated in TNDs.
Oh, I see. We don't set the deletion timestamp?
Right.
Okay. Right.
We don't set the grace period seconds, even if it's provided.
Okay, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but I will.
That's right. Otherwise, how can Kubernetes know when to delete?
Well, only storages which explicitly say that they do graceful deletion will set that timestamp. And today, pod storage is the only one that says it does. So all other storage ignores the graceful deletion option because none of those resources implement graceful deletion.
So they don't set the deletion timestamp?
They don't preserve, not the deletion timestamp, the grace period seconds. So a delete request comes in, says, I want to delete and give 30 seconds grace period. Only pods will record.
It doesn't propagate the option from the URL.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Yeah, but it's unclear what, okay, yeah, I see.
So are they saying for pods, we are also maybe eventually move to finalizer instead of building this function?
Maybe. I don't know. It seems disruptive for a little bit of it at the moment, but maybe eventually it'd be a good idea.
So if we recorded the information from the user, then someone like KubeVirt who wanted to use it, the first step would be when you spin up a VM and you're managing it for the user, before you start doing stuff with that VM, add your finalizer. And then you will get a chance to participate in teardown. And you will have a hint from the user whether they want a graceful teardown or immediate teardown based on whether they recorded a graceful deletion seconds.
All right. Let's, we've used a quarter of our time on a quarter of our items, so let's go on. Use cases for initializers.
Yeah, so Clayton started the thread last week asking whether people had use cases for initializers as distinct from mutating webhook admission. And the only example that he and I came up with that really asked for something like initializers was namespace initialization. Namespaces in particular, since they are our scoping object. And they're already special in the sense of their teardown and their phases, and maybe there's an additional phase for I'm initializing this namespace. But as a generic concept, we were struggling to come up with additional use cases.
So I was at KubeCon, and I don't think I actually got to respond to that thread, but I intended to say the primary differences, as I see it, is that initializers could, in theory, run in parallel, but it's pretty hard to run mutating admission webhooks in parallel.
Yeah, there are. Do we have a use case that really wants that, though? That is worth a use case that really wants it, that can't reasonably be solved in another way, that...
Yeah, I'm not necessarily arguing for keeping both. I think we probably shouldn't keep both. And webhooks are clearly the winners if we don't keep both. And it's true we don't have today people scrambling to run things in parallel.
Yeah, and it's hard to reason about.
I think the trajectory of webhooks is such that people will, in the next, I don't know, 6 months or a year, have many webhooks on their cluster, and we will have to think about the latency we're getting.
Well, I mean, yeah, there's not a whole lot of. Once you go to webhooks, there's not a whole lot of option for parallelizing them in a generic way. Because you can't.
I mean,
end up under the diagraph for them.
We could think about like maybe we could take the apply format and allow webhooks to send back like overlays that are composable.
Well, you can't determine which.
That works for some webhooks, but not all.
Yeah, you can't determine which mutating webhooks relied on another mutating webhook coming before them.
Yeah, we'd still have to have like some system of like.
Yeah.
Comes out.
Dependency management to build a graph.
Everybody likes making graph problems into their API, right?
Yeah, that's just not a happy place to be. The one thing that I was concerned about, if we did go down the path of eliminating initializers, I think I would want to create the idea of a namespace initialization phase. Yeah,
I think there's discussion on like the multi-tenancy SIG list or something about namespace initialization, and like in particular, people have this problem where they want to create a bunch of resources that lock down the namespace before other people are allowed to create things in the namespace.
Yeah.
But it's not obvious to me that adding like building in an initialization phase really makes that problem much better. I don't know.
It makes it possible to enforce in an easy and generic way. So today we have a namespace lifecycle admission plugin. And if you introduce the concept of namespace initialization, you will be able to have that admission plugin run the checks for you. And that admission plugin is in the generic API server.
Right. But then like the people who are allowed to make the things have to have permission to do stuff while it's initializing.
Yeah, so that's why the admission plugin that we have today is an ideal place to do it, because it has the ability to run those secondary auth checks.
Yeah. So, but it seems to me like this is a matter of convenience, and it's not like you could set up the same security situation with RBAC rules, right? Like it comes down to somebody has permission to make stuff while it's initializing, and other people don't.
Kind of, but not exactly, right? So with an RBAC rule, you would have something like this controller has permission to create pods in all namespaces. And it has that permission at the cluster scope. So a new namespace appears, and it's in an initialization phase. You could not use RBAC to restrict a controller that has these global permissions, or anyone that has that sort of a global permission. You can only use it to restrict people who do not have global permissions. But if you were to create an initialization phase, you would be able to prevent accidents, right? Someone would come in, and if you were initializing, you would have a subset of users who have permissions to do something on initializing namespaces. And
so you're thinking like only a couple controllers would have the permission to initialize stuff and normal controllers wouldn't?
Yeah. And I do see the namespace as a special case because I know we have special cases for it in OpenShift around this exact area.
Yeah, I do think namespace is a special case in that like it's something that our SIG owns rather than any other SIG.
It's normal to want to set up your container before it's considered ready.
Yeah, I think namespaces are really a property of like the API machinery and not necessarily the cluster machinery, if that makes sense.
Partitioning the API, not the cluster.
Yeah, it's an API concept, not a. I mean, we use it to also be a physical concept in clusters, but it's primarily an API concept.
I know Chow and Eric put a lot of thought into the initializers versus webhooks back in like November,
and the upshot of that was that we switched to webhooks.
Right, and the question we opened at that time was, could those solve all of the initializer use cases? There's a doc out somewhere.
We can
maybe drop that into the notes at least. don't need to go through that whole thought exercise again because that was.
I think namespaces are kind of the one that it clearly doesn't, because before a namespace can be ready, you might want to create other things like quota and restrictions and things inside that namespace, but you cannot do that as part of a webhook because the namespace must exist before the initializer can go create stuff inside it.
Why can't you do this inside a webhook?
Because the webhook, if you restricted everything, I see.
I mean, it may not be super convenient to set it up, but
yeah, I mean, at that point, it's basically semantics whether it's an initialization phase of a namespace or not.
I think the strongest argument for keeping initializers is just symmetry. It's nice to have initializers and finalizers, so I think that will end up being the truth.
No, I think it is kind of nice with initializers that every write in the stack actually goes into etcd. So you have a lot of you have a big audit trail. If you're investigating process, you see a series of writes. Whereas if you're trying to debug a webhook and there's like, I don't know, you're up to like 30 webhooks, like all those webhooks get called from API server and nothing gets committed to disk until they all succeed or all fail. So there's less visibility into what's going on.
It's not just less visibility. The initializers, if it's long enough, are going to be more resilient, right? You can have the API server crash between every initializer step.
Yeah, sorry.
And you will still succeed, whereas in a webhook, you will never succeed.
Yeah, that's the other thing I was going to say in that email thread is that if you stack together 30 initializers, there's no risk of like an API server dying halfway through and losing all that context. But if you stack together 30 webhooks and API server crashes on the 29th one, you're kind of out of luck.
Yeah, that's true. It's a lot of it comes down to how much complexity are we willing to push into the API to avoid that.
The other thing too is that initializers add complexity to anyone who is observing the API. So what we saw when we started doing initializers was that most of the controllers kind of lost their minds that were trying to act on objects and had to have quite a bit of logic around, I'm watching objects but not uninitialized ones, and if I try to create an object, I might get back an already exists error, and then when I go look for it, it won't actually be there because it's not initialized yet, and I'm filtering out uninitialized things. And so I think there's a lot of complexity either way, and with initializers, we push that complexity onto like quote unquote normal API consumers and controllers, and with webhooks, we push that complexity onto the webhook authors to make sure they're well behaved and idempotent.
So in terms of wrapping this item up, I think that initializers are sort of on the chopping block, but do we need to make this decision right now?
I'd like to make this decision going into 112, right? I don't plan to take any action in 111, but going into 112, I'd like to have an idea of whether we're keeping it or not, and if not, what we're going to be doing about an initialization phase for namespaces before we pull it out.
The other thing I would add is, and not that I'm saying we need to necessarily keep initializers, is that if all you're trying to do is mutate something on initialization and you don't want to deal with certificates, initializers are a lot easier to do. So I think we need to figure out the certs problem, which we've been talking about for a while.
Yeah, I do have
got a lot easier for people in the near future. So, I don't think that should drive the technical direction.
Yeah, Andy, I do have a poll starting to split that out in OpenShift. By the way, the service serving cert signer. We'll still take your reviews downstream.
Sure. Just tag me.
So I guess I kind of lean to keep them only for namespaces, just for symmetry, and because namespace is already special, and because the question comes up. But
all right.
I don't feel super strongly. Like it's like either that or delete them entirely.
So I am going to bring this up again, but just before we finish on 111, just to make sure we land on the same page. I just want to talk about it now because
Yeah.
not my mind.
Do we think that we're the right group of people to make this decision, or should we ask architecture?
I wouldn't mind seeing it go to architecture. I also think that if you and I and Clayton and Jordan and Andy and if all the people who were responsible for the initial implementation and compared and contrasted both approaches have come to the conclusion that it is a level of complexity that doesn't serve us in the long run, I think it would be hard for a group to say, no, you have to keep this complexity that you can't manage.
Yeah, I agree. So I think I think probably the thing I would like to see is a document or something sketching out how we'd implement a real namespace initialization phase.
Okay.
I think that would be good. Like if we solve that, then I think that this question would become very clear.
Okay, that makes sense.
We'd also make like a bunch of people really happy.
True.
API machinery, making more people happy than sad.
Yeah, if only that were true.
Here's the score
library. Okay, let's go on. Dynamic client changes.
Yeah.
David, well, you can talk about it.
Sure. This came up. I spoke with Chow about it yesterday. Over the past week or two, I introduced a dynamic client that isn't based on a client pool and doesn't have some of the weird arguments like a REST mapper and a path function something, and is focused on an experience like our existing generated clients. So you create a new dynamic client, then you tell it, I want to work with this kind of a resource, then you give it a namespace if you need to, and then you issue a list or a get, or whatever other verb you have. That client worked well. We've transitioned over all the core Kubernetes code, and what we've done for migration is put the old client pool approach into a different package so that the new package, so the existing package holds our new dynamic interface, and if somebody needs a transition period and doesn't want to switch immediately, they can depend on the deprecated package instead.
Yeah, we should make that clear in like release notes and stuff.
Yeah, the release note already mentioned it, and I can add something about the QPS bit that you mentioned. The thing that's getting mentioned there is that the old client pool approach meant that when you set a QPS on your client config, that QPS actually applied with a fresh QPS every time you pulled a new API resource. So if you had 30 API resources and your QPS was set to 5, you had a QPS of 150, not 5. The new client, if you set it to 5, no matter how many resources you access, you get 5. So it's kind of fixing the bug, but if you were depending on the bug to let you sneak in more QPS, you get bit.
Yeah.
So.
And by the way, I think we all know this, but just to state it, like the client-side QPS limit is a terrible idea. And if anybody feels like implementing like back pressure or rate limiting on the server, like, yeah, that'd be awesome. It's also really hard, which is why it's not.
I wouldn't reject a poll. Yeah. I want a pony. And then the last, and then now with this dynamic client, it should be possible if someone wanted to write a generic lister, watcher, reflector, and informer. I haven't done that, but it should theoretically be possible now. The last thing is API registration. So I don't know how many people knew, but whenever you try to write a new API and then register it with our scheme and pieces like that, you had a large block in which you constructed, let me try to get this right, you constructed a group meta factory args to then get fluffed up to create an intermediate object that you would then call with a set of functions to add to a scheme, which you would then call to create a group meta information, which you would then call to add to a registry. All those layers are now gone, and the registration for your APIs looks like a series of add to scheme calls, and then setting a version priority on the scheme. So it's a default version priority where you can later look and say, what if I have no specific intent, what should I use to serialize? And it gives you back-end ordering.
Yep. This is
because it's a significant change.
Like, this is a huge improvement.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for doing that.
And to be clear, this is only impacting people who were either setting up their own API servers or setting up their own schemes for some reason. All of the generated client sets already set up schemes for you. So
yeah.
all the generated clients and things, you won't notice this at all. But.
Yep. Cool. Any other items that weren't on the agenda? All right. Thanks, everybody. I will stop the recording.